Offset I formation with Arian Foster, the tailback. Gets the feed right side across the 15, 10, 5. Walks in. Touchdown, Foster.
Run it up. Foster breaks a tackle. Foster with a beautiful move. Foster will go all the way. What a move by Foster.
He's got it off in time as Foster breaks down the sideline, uses his blockers, still going for the touchdown.
As of 2025, Arian Foster, to this day, is the all-time leading rusher of the Houston Texans. If you were a fan of the Texans during the early 2010s, then you know of the sheer dominance this guy brought to the team. Every single week, defensive coordinators scrambled to find counterattacks to Foster. Coming into the league undrafted, it was as if this guy had popped out of nowhere. In fact, there was even a point where the Texans had released him after signing him as an undrafted free agent. However, little did they know that the decision to sign him back onto the practice squad and eventually the active roster would be a decision that would change the course of their franchise forever. Arian Foster began his collegiate career for the Tennessee Volunteers in 2005. From the very start, Foster was already proving himself to be a formidable back in the SEC, as in his freshman season he would finish as the leading rusher of Tennessee with 879 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. His breakout game came against South Carolina, where he would rush for 148 yards with a rushing touchdown. He would rush for more than 100 yards for the following games up until the game against the Vanderbilt Commodores. Foster would perform his best college game yet, scoring 2 touchdowns with 268 all-purpose yards, equaling the 3rd highest total in school history. With all this success, Foster would hope to continue the momentum for the following year. However, during his sophomore season, due to injury issues and the emergence of LaMarcus Coker, Montario Hardesty, he would unfortunately see the field less, this time ending the season with only 322 rushing yards and again 5 touchdowns. One of the most infamous plays to come from this season came during the 2007 Outback Bowl.
It's the Volunteers of Tennessee with a record of 9-3 against the 8-4 Nittany Lions of Penn State in the Outback Bowl. What great memories will be created today.
In the 4th quarter, deep in Penn State territory, Foster would fumble the ball, which would be returned for 88 yards as a scoop and score for Penn State. Tennessee would eventually lose this game 20-10, with a sour ending to the sophomore season of Foster. Junior year would be Foster's breakout season. As the starting running back for Tennessee, he had something to prove, and well, he began to cook.
First down, breaking free now is Foster. In a foot race for the end zone.
Here, Page on first down, hands off Arian Foster. Foster on the trigger boards. Touchdown, Tennessee. Handoff. Foster picking his way, gets down to the 15 to the 10, breaks another tackle to the 5, powering to the end zone. They knock him out of bounds. Foster, the tailback, they'll try him. He dives up in the air and into the end zone.
Game after game, Foster was filling up the stat sheet. The game that really directed the nation's eyes to this running back from Tennessee was their matchup against the number 12 ranked Georgia Bulldogs. In a game where Tennessee were heavy underdogs, Foster torched the Georgia defense for 98 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. He would follow up this performance against the Mississippi State Bulldogs with 139 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Foster's name was being put on the map, and he would continue to be a fire to the Tennessee offense. Foster would crack 1,000 yards for the season in an OT thriller against the University of Kentucky and would rush for 118 yards with 98 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown to cap off a brilliant day. He would finish the 2007 season with 1,193 rushing yards and 12 touchdowns, with another 340 receiving yards with 2 receiving touchdowns. With all this being said, you may be asking yourself, how did Foster not get drafted at all? In fact, he ranked 3rd in rushing yards in the SEC and even resulted in a 2nd round grade from the draft advisory board. However, Foster would make the grave mistake of returning for another season. Thanks to his coach Philip Fulmer convincing him, Foster came back for another season. Tennessee would be utilizing a completely new offensive scheme. Unfortunately, this was meant to help more the other running backs on the team, as Foster would begin to see his workload diminish. He would only rush for more than 100 yards in one game, and the rest of the season would weaken his legacy. Despite this, to this day, Foster holds the record for the second most career rushing yards for the Volunteers at 2,964 rushing yards, but the damage this season did was monumental. His draft stock would plummet. He couldn't work out at the NFL scouting combine due to a pulled hamstring, and to top it all off, his showing at the pro day was underwhelming. Thanks to all these factors, Foster would eventually go undrafted in the 2009 NFL draft.
Alright, I just want to do something in my life that to make sure that, you know, when I had a kid, that she never had to worry about the lights being on. She didn't have to worry about any of that, and it was tough. That's one thing my family always had was, you know, we smiled through it all, and that's why I try to remain as optimistic as possible.
In 2009, the Texans signed Foster as an undrafted free agent, but would eventually release him on September 5th. At the time, the Texans' lead rusher was Steve Sladen, and coming fresh off a 1,200 rushing yard season the previous year, the Texans seemed to be keen on sticking to him for the 2009 season. However, Foster would eventually sign to the practice squad the following day, and the Texans liked what they saw, so they signed him to the active roster on November 17th. Foster wouldn't really see the field much this year, however he would eventually score his first touchdown against the Miami Dolphins in Week 16. Following that, Foster would make his first career start in the season finale against the New England Patriots, an opportunity he took full advantage of, rushing for 119 yards and 2 scores. But this was only the beginning for Foster. He was about to show the league who they missed out on. The turn of the new decade brought hope for the Texans. Foster had worked his way up the roster. Number 37 was gone, and now it was number 23's time to shine. This year, Foster replaced Sladen as a starting running back, and what the Texans got was a season opener for the ages. To this day, this is one of the most iconic Texans games of all time, as Foster embarrassed the Indy defense for 231 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns for the day. This broke a franchise record for the Texans at the time for the most rushing yards in a single game, and the second highest rushing yard total ever in an NFL opener, just behind O.J. Simpson. From that point on, Foster never looked back. He continued decimating defenses around the league, from 187 total scrimmage yards against the Raiders to 102 rushing yards again versus the Colts, to a dominant 197 scrimmage yards against the Chargers, to 143 rushing yards against the Titans. Foster was proving to be a menace for opposing defenses, and despite the Texans going 6-10 for the season, Foster proved to be the real deal. He ended the season off with 1,616 rushing yards, top of the league, 2,220 scrimmage yards, top of the league, and 18 total touchdowns, also ranked top of the league. An undrafted running back with this production was madness, and in a span of a year, Foster had become one of the best running backs in the entire league. Foster would make his first Pro Bowl in his first year as a starter. The Texans had just stumbled upon a generational player, and it was only a matter of time before Foster carried the Houston Texans to heights never seen before in franchise history. Picture this. The Houston Texans are 10-3 for the first time in franchise history, winning their 7th consecutive game against the Cincinnati Bengals and punching a ticket to the NFL playoffs for the first time in franchise history behind backup quarterback T.J. Yates. How was this run possible, you may ask? Andre Johnson, J.J. Watt, Brian Cushing, Matt Schaub, and oh yeah, the best running back in the league. Arian Foster picked right back up where he left off from 2010. Foster wouldn't play until Game 4 against the Steelers, rushing for 155 yards and a touchdown. If Foster wasn't succeeding in the rushing attack, he was killing defenses on screen plays and receptions. Foster legitimately was a threat whichever way you looked at it, and he made it seem like he was playing Madden on rookie mode. One of Foster's best games came from against the Tennessee Titans, where he would rush for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns, while also accumulating 119 yards receiving and another touchdown. Foster had truly hit his prime, and the entire nation was about to get a glimpse of him in January football.
Reliant Stadium next to the old Astrodome as the NFL NFL playoffs open on Wild Card Saturday. The Bengals against the Texans.
Texans were in the playoffs for the first time ever, a momentous occasion for the city of Houston, and Foster came to work. Foster came in to help bring one of the most iconic wins in Texans history, rushing for 153 yards and 2 touchdowns in a decisive victory against the Bengals to move on to the divisional round. Although they would fall short to the Ravens in the divisional round, Foster still accumulated 132 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. The Texans were a promising team, and the legacy for the Texans would grow even more in the following season. Fresh off a contract extension, Foster would continue his dominance as he would open up the season with 79 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns against the Miami Dolphins. On Monday Night Football against the Jets, Foster reached the 5,000 yards of scrimmage mark in his 40th career game, becoming the 3rd fastest player to reach that milestone, only behind Edgerrin James and Eric Dickerson. He was putting himself in elite company in just 40 career games, and the league watched as the Texans became a Super Bowl contender for the first time in history. The Texans started 11-1, only to drop the next 3 out of the last 4 games. This year though, the Texans were all in for a title run. Foster again would make light work of the Bengals in the wild card round, rushing for 140 yards and a touchdown. However, they faced a formidable opponent in the Tom Brady-led Patriots, who embarrassed them earlier in the season. Foster would post just 90 yards and a touchdown, but it was nowhere near enough to overcome the stout offense of the Patriots. Foster would end off the season with 1,424 rushing yards and 15 rushing touchdowns. It seemed as though the Texans were still knocking on the door for a true title run, but just as quickly as the championship window opened for Houston, it would close almost immediately shut. 2013 brought a nightmare season for the Texans, as after starting 2-0 they would lose 14 straight to end off the season. And as for Foster, as much as he tried to contribute, he injured his back in a game against the Colts, which required him to have surgery and ultimately missed the rest of the 2013 season. Now Foster was no stranger to injuries at the time. In fact, he had a knee meniscus tear during the 2010 season but managed to play through it entirely. How was he able to do it, you may ask?
Mine don't matter, man.
Foster also had injuries to his hamstrings before, and even a moment where he had an irregular heartbeat. Still, he pushed through, and there was not a doubt in Texans fans' minds that he'd be back for the 2014 season, ready to go. 2014 can be named as the final ride of Texans legend Arian Foster. As mid as the Texans were in the passing game, they had one weapon on the ground, and that was Arian Foster. Starting off the season with 2 straight games rushing for over 100 yards, but an injury to the groin would keep him out for the following game. He would return against Dallas for week 5, and from there recorded another 4 straight games for over 100 rushing yards. One of his best games came against the Tennessee Titans, rushing for 151 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. He would strain his groin in week 9, sidelining him for 2 games. However, he was able to finish the season with a strong 1,246 yards and 8 touchdowns. Despite some setbacks, Foster was still a solid back in the league and was definitely Houston's most important weapon.
Patrick with time, he fires and the catch is made by Foster. Takes it all the way for a Texans touchdown.
During his first padded practice of the season, Foster again would suffer another groin injury. He would be placed on IR to start the 2015 season, designated to return in week 4. However, upon returning, Foster was a shell of his former self. He would rush for a total of only 163 yards across the span of 4 games. And during the final game of that 4-game span against the Dolphins, tragedy would strike Foster as he would rupture his Achilles tendon, effectively ending his season and, in hindsight, his football career. I recall a memory of watching this game at the age of 11 and legitimately being heartbroken at the sight of Foster grabbing his foot. This man had been through so many different injuries at this point in his young career, with this one being his most serious yet. At this point, he had not played a full 16-game season since 2012, thus prompting the Texans to release him in March of 2016. He would eventually sign a 1-year deal with the Miami Dolphins, posting very mediocre stats before eventually suffering another groin injury in week 3. After returning and rushing for just 5 yards in the game against the Bills, Foster would officially announce his retirement from the NFL. Arian Foster will forever be regarded as a Houston Texans legend. He was one of the most important pieces that made the Texans actually competitive for the first time in their franchise history, I myself became a Texans fan because of his dominance, and he is one of the reasons the fan base has grown to the size it has today. At one point, Foster was regarded as the best running back in the entire league, and as an undrafted player coming out of college, he definitely proved a lot of his critics wrong. Foster has embraced his artistic side after football, and he has made it clear that football was always meant to be a temporary thing for him. His story is a testament to the brutal nature of the NFL running back, the shorter careers, and how quickly a player's body can deteriorate under the position. In his heart, he is a poet, reader, songwriter, and as he stated in an interview during the Joe Rogan podcast,
Like, if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't have never played football. I'd be a scientist.
regardless, he has done so much for the Houston community, and it's thanks to him that I'll forever consider myself a Houston Texans fan and an Arian Foster supporter.